Hello, Chloe.
Hello, Becca.
Hello. Would you just introduce people to you, please?
I certainly shall. Hello, everybody. I'm Chloe Clark. I'm an actor and audio description consultant and general disability rights activist person, I would say,
Fantastic.
in a
And I'm
nutshell. Really.
just pop yourself into a little perfect little golden bubble there. Very, very nice. I also know you have wonderful gifts with music and singing and things as well. I've worked with you on projects where you do that sort of thing as well. So yeah, there's so much more to say about Chloe, but we can't spend the whole time talking about you, Chloe. Don't even ask. Just stop going on about yourself. um, we're here to talk, I think, with your with all the skills you can bring to bear on it, as I be interesting to chat about. Helen Keller, who I know incredibly little about, actually. But what I know is from a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me, which I shared with you because I'd only ever heard of Helen Keller as a sort of martyr and a martyr slash saint to being kind of rescued by people who worked out how to talk to her and how to save her, if you like. And then in this book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, it is pointed out that actually she was a radical socialist and a suffragette and had a whole sort of life that I knew nothing about and that was written out really of presenting her in order that I suppose people without disabilities or not facing a society that disabled us um, can feel good about themselves having rescued her. Um,
Mm.
what did you think about that book when I shared it? Where did that take you and all of that? What was your journey through Helen Keller based on me going, I want to talk to you about this?
Yes. Well, it was really interesting because actually I didn't know a vast amount about Helen Keller either, but I was aware that she was a bit of a kick-ass, fearsome lady. But beyond that, I didn't really know anything. And I also obviously had the same experience as you of knowing her for being this brave little girl who overcame her disabilities because of the help of these wonderful saints who came along and saved her, exactly as you're saying. I think we're quite lucky in the UK. We aren't subjected to that at school as they are in the States. And obviously she is very much a hero, taught as a hero in the States to children growing up there, and used as an inspirational model for overcoming adversity and just working hard and being determined. And if you are determined and work hard, you can overcome anything, because if she can overcome being blind and deaf, then you've got no excuses, sort of thing. So I think, as James puts it in that book, only a handful of people recognize her for her adult years, being a radical socialist, political activist and advocate for all sorts of different human rights groups. But something that I notice very, very few people pick up on is that it sort of heralded as a massive achievement that she did learn to speak. And she herself in her autobiography talks about what a huge blessing and an amazing life-changing thing it was to be able to learn to communicate with people, with the world around her, and particularly learning to speak. But nobody sort of recognizes that is not necessarily a very positive thing, that a deaf person is essentially forced to speak in order to be able to communicate with the world around them, rather than the world around them adapting to that individual and learning to sign. And I interviewed Caro Parker about this yesterday, and she's absolutely amazing, put it so well, that, had Helen Keller been able to communicate in her own natural way, she, could have really flourished. Whereas instead, she had a lifetime of people speaking for her or helping her, in inverted commas, to adapt to the way that, to be more normal, in inverted commas. So I think it's fascinating that still, I think, indicates that we are still in our society and very much in the mindset that disabled people have to adapt to the world around them, and it is their impairment that makes them disabled rather than the world around them, which anyone. Yes, exactly. Yeah, we're disabled by our environments and the fact that other people don't. So for example, if we're deaf, nobody signs. Why aren't children at school taught to sign all the way through school so that we can actually all communicate with one another? We're taught French and German so we can speak to people from other countries, but we're not taught to speak to people in our own country, you know. So it's, that was what struck me most, I think, about all of the accounts I've seen and read about her.
Would it be useful for us to play that interview with Caro now? Shall I do that?
Yes, I think you should.
Here it is then.
So Caro, one of the things that I found most frustrating when researching Helen Keller was that a handful of people recognised that she should have been remembered for, or she should be remembered for, being a radical political thinker, rather than the fact that she was so wonderful and such an inspiration that she overcame her disabilities, as they always put it, and learned to speak. And nobody seems to recognise the fact that that isn't necessarily a wonderfully positive thing when a deaf person is forced to learn to speak for the rest of the world. So I just wonder what your experience as a deaf person has been in that regard, in speaking and learning to speak when you were growing up.
Well, my experience turned out quite positive because I'm able to speak so well and interact so well, but I come from a hearing family. But there's little regard for the deaf person. For many, many years, deaf people have been saying it's okay to sign. It's not a bad thing. And children respond better to visual communication than oral anyway. And now the experts are saying it's good for children to learn sign language. In fact, they're encouraging it. And deaf people are now saying, we've been saying that for centuries. So it's quite ironic, really, that the awareness and woke thing is now happening. Now, as I said, my experience was positive. My mum learned how to give me speech therapy. And I remember sitting with my mum with a book at the table. I was about 6 or 7, and learning the word lion. And she would have headphones and a microphone, and we'd read the book together, and the word lion came up. And I remember learning how to say lion, lion, with the tongue on the top of my lip rather than behind my teeth. And I was going, lion, lion, because that's how I learned how to say L. And then Mum said, yes, now pull the tongue back for lion rather than lion. Do you know what I mean? I don't know if she could tell the difference. When my parents found out I was deaf, they got in contact with the National Deaf Children's Society. They're quite proactive in finding information. My parents are not academic, but they're very street smart, if you know what I mean. So they found out there was an experiment going on at Manchester University. And we lived quite close to Manchester. And we used to go every couple of times a year to Manchester University, and I would sit at a little table, and this very tall, hairy, grizzly man would sit opposite me, and he would have a microphone and I would have headphones, and he'd sit down on a little chair, you know, his knees off his, you know, nearly bouncing off his chin, and he'd have farm animals, and he'd say things like, this is a dog barking, woof, 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 this is a cow mooing, moo, 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 and things like that. And you get a piece of paper, and this is paper rustling, and he shaped the paper. And then they blindfold me, and I had to guess what the sound was. And every time I got it right, I got a piece of chocolate. My mum and dad weren't happy about that because I'm diabetic. On the way home in my dad's new car, I was sick. Dad wasn't very happy about that. So that's one of my earliest experiences of speech therapy. And I think it's okay if the deaf person would like to speak and communicate, but it never occurs to hearing people to learn sign language. It's not a secret language. It can be learned. So I think now, I hope rather, now there's more awareness and people are woke, for want of a word. More people will learn sign language and fewer deaf people will have to learn speech.
Yeah.
I got away with it because I got extra training. I wear hearing aids. I can actually hear the vowels of speech. I can't hear the consonants, which is where lip reading and sign language comes in. But I can actually hear the vowels. So if someone's talking to me, what I get is, so I have to work it out. It's all of that's why I can do gobbledygook really, really well, because it's what I hear all the time. So hopefully there will be change in how deaf people are allowed to communicate from now on. And I think it's a good thing to learn both sign language and speech if you want to learn speech. But I don't think I think it should be up to the person how they want to communicate.
Yes.
And not up to the hearing people who want to feel better because they can understand this person now, even though the speech is not very clear. And because the speech is not very clear, deaf people get bullied, they get abuse, they get taunted with the sounds that they're making because they weren't allowed to learn how to communicate in the best way they can.
Yeah, yeah. It's really interesting. I mean, that's so hit the point so firmly on the head that it has to be the individual's desire to want to speak, not forced on them by the rest of society because it makes them feel more comfortable. And it does. It's interesting that you say now experts are saying, oh, sign language is good. We should be learning sign language. And I know, for example, like hearing children are taught Makaton and sign in early stages now as a really positive thing, but not to communicate with deaf people just because it's a communication tool for them, whereas some deaf children are still being taught they need to speak rather than sign, and that those experts are hearing people who have said, oh, sign is good, and now only those people will be listened to, as opposed to the whole deaf community saying no, sign language is good. We've been saying that for decades. So yeah, it just goes to show it needs to come from that community, doesn't it? And people starting to be aware of these communities more is a really positive thing. Something that really struck me about Helen Keller was what I've heard a clip of her being interviewed on camera, and she says, my biggest regret in life is that I never learned to speak normally, because I could have helped so many more people if I had. And it just struck me as such a deeply, I was sort of moved by it, and I completely understood what she meant, but I was also really upset by it because it's just so perfectly indicative of a world that has said, you need to speak, and that's the only way you can help people. And you need to speak normally. And the other side of that was, I actually don't think her interpreter was, because Helen Keller speaks and then her interpreter repeats so that it's clearer. I don't think her interpreter actually did interpret her words exactly. I think Helen said speak naturally, and her interpreter said speak normally. And they're two completely different inferences there. So anyway, that's another thing. But this idea of people putting words in deaf people's mouths as well and speaking for them as opposed to letting them speak for themselves in whatever language they choose is really, really frustrating.
And also I think because sign language as a language is so different to English, the grammatical structure of the language is very different. It's more aligned to German and Japanese language rather than English language, which is very complicated, as we know. So because of that, when deaf people try to speak in BSL grammatical structure, it makes them sound very uneducated. It makes them not sound so clever because the structure of the language is different. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So people don't regard deaf people as intelligent because we speak in a different way, totally. Even with speech training, we speak differently. We speak in pictures.
Yeah.
We communicate in pictures because that's how we perceive the world. We don't perceive the world in English. We perceive the world as we see it.
Yeah.
So the language is very, very minimal in some ways, but with such depth as tension and emotion and nuances. But it comes across as we're being aggressive, and we're not. We're just being expressive.
Yes.
So the more the people are exposed to sign language, like on television or going to the theatre or daily lives, the more people will understand how we communicate. So, yes.
Yes. Yeah. It's interesting. Your story about learning to speak and the fact that it's actually a positive thing for you because it does help you communicate with people and you wanted to do it, more importantly. Reminds me when I was growing up, it's a different thing, but I remember my mum really drilling into me that I had to look at people when they were speaking to me because I wouldn't naturally do that as a blind person. And she just knew that if I didn't appear to communicate in the same way as other people when I was older, I'd be really, really limited. You know, basically, if I looked as blind as I am, I would be much more limited in life because of the perceptions of others. And she was absolutely right. And I'm really, really grateful that she drummed that into me from an early age, because it has meant that other people feel a lot more comfortable with me than they perhaps otherwise would. So it's really interesting, isn't it, that these things make us feel more comfortable simply because they're making other people feel more comfortable. And is the world ever going to wake up to learning to feel comfortable with people who don't appear like them or communicate like them? Or, you know, do you think that the world is shifting in that way now?
I think the world, because we're getting more access to more information, so therefore our perception of the world is changing and our regard of the world is changing. And you were saying about your mum wanting you to look at people when talking with them. It is our culture, as in British culture, to have eye contact when we're talking. And it's definitely deaf culture to have eye contact when we're talking. But if you go to a different part of the world where it's not their culture to have eye contact, in fact, to have eye contact is looked upon as aggressive in some cultures of the world, and they don't want you to look at them at all when they're talking. So I think, yes, the world's perception of us as beings, a part of society, with more information, is changing. I think more stories about us, from us, not from a sighted person writing blind stories or a deaf person writing deaf stories. And even people in history like Helen Keller, their story is very much modified by hearing people. Oh, isn't she brave? Isn't she wonderful? And Helen Keller responding with guilt because she couldn't be who she wanted to be, which is imposed on her by other people. And there's a lot of people with disabilities in therapy because of this. We're not allowed to be who we actually are. I think you have to be very strong to be able to decipher who you are and how you can be with other people around you with their expectations.
Yeah.
So,
yeah,
I've worked with actors who's never worked with deaf people before, and they're very surprised they find me funny.
Wow, really?
Yes.
Why?
I don't know. I don't think they expect deaf people to be funny. And I once worked with an actor, a director. I was recommended by somebody for a show years ago at Hampstead Theatre.
Yeah.
And Simon Stone was the director. And he came up to me at the end of rehearsals and said, "You're actually very good, aren't you?" And he was surprised that I could act.
Oh.
So I think people have low expectations of us or high expectations of us.
Yeah.
And it's all about, why should we meet their expectations? Why can't we just be who we are, functioning in the way that we function? Yeah. So Helen Keller, I feel, didn't reach her full potential because she was being held back by people who were thinking they were bringing out her potential. And what they were doing was suppressing it.
Yes.
Because if she was allowed to communicate in the way that she wanted to communicate, she could have helped the people she wanted to help.
Yeah.
She thought she could help people by speaking clearly. But no, she needed to help people by being who she is and reaching her full potential in her own way, not in the way expected from the people, inverted commas, helping her.
Yes.
So
yeah,
that's my view.
That's so perfectly and beautifully put, Caro. Thank you so much. I think that's a really good place to end the recording, actually, and just thank you, because that just completely summarizes everything I wanted to say in a much better way than I ever would have said it. And it's brilliant to get, a deaf perspective on it as well, because obviously we cover Helen Keller, don't we? Because we've got the blind and the deaf together.
Yes, we do.
Yeah,
we do. So, we are the divided parts of Helen Keller. But we are also Chloe and Caro.
Yes.
Influencing the world in our own way.
Very, very true.
The marvellous Caro Parker there. Thank you very much for that very, very illuminating interview. I loved it. Caro's coming up later in our season as well, actually. We're doing an episode with her about Rosa Parks, so that should be fun as well. But that's quite interesting, because that brings us to, and you and Caro both disability rights campaigners now, and I wondered if you felt like, looking as you have at Helen Keller, you're seeing a very different experience, or whether you're seeing how far we've come, or how far we haven't changed really as a society. What were your thoughts on that?
Well, interestingly, it's sort of both in equal measure. It's really quite paradoxical and very complex, as was Helen Keller herself, I think. That it feels like, yes, because of all the work done by disability rights activists throughout the decades before us, we are standing on the shoulders of giants. We have a lot to thank them for, and we have progressed a huge way because of that. I feel throughout, back in the 80s when I was growing up, it still wasn't great. And I wonder if children now in the education system would have a very different experience, for better or worse, I don't know. But I feel like I've had a lot of opportunities and things that I wouldn't have had 100 years ago, certainly. And language has certainly adapted slightly. It's still not social model language by and large. It's, the understanding behind the language and why certain language is appropriate or not still isn't there really by and large, but people are becoming more aware.
And that's true in even in that book, The Lies My Teachers Told Me, which has got some really great stuff in it, he still uses quite what we would consider to be old-fashioned, inappropriate language around it, doesn't he?
Yes, I mean, he refers to handicapped a lot, which is only just now sort of being eradicated from the vocabulary in America, I think, or most of my American friends would know not to use that term anymore.
It's still in our law though as well. There are still laws that were in, because I know some of my friends are campaigning to change those laws around that refer to handicapped people, and the argument amongst my friends, apart from the artists, if the language of your law is so archaic, how on earth can the law itself be up to date? Like we need to review this clearly. Look at the language that shows that, let alone what it's actually putting down in concrete for us to have to live by.
Exactly. Yes, completely. As a digression, Helen Keller, the reading I'm doing is Helen Keller's speech, Why Men Need Women's Suffrage, and she makes that point about laws being, what's the term she uses? Laws not being created for women in this particular case, but obviously laws are not created for disabled people, what we're referencing. And yes, exactly, if the language is outdated, it shows that the thought behind it is very, very archaic too. And the reason handicapped is a bad term to use is because it comes from the charity model of disability, which literally refers to cap in hand. Disability was so synonymous with begging, all disabled people would be out on the street begging, that handicap refers to those poor disabled people begging and needing charity.
With their cap in their hand.
Yes.
I did not know that. Wow. Yeah, that makes it, that's quite a good reason not to use that, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. What would be the things that you would like to see changed? What do you campaign on currently, just in what most immediate things, if you had a magic wand?
Well, I think, okay, so as I'm an actor and I work a lot in campaigning within the arts industry, I think representation through the arts and media really needs to change. At the moment, stories about disability are all told by non-disabled people, and generally acted by non-disabled actors and directed by non-disabled directors. And you have a lot of non-disabled people telling our stories about us, and very few opportunities for us to tell our own stories, perform them ourselves. And disabled people need to infiltrate every level of the arts industry. We need stage managers and directors and writers and actors and everything in order to have that truthful, authentic representation, and stop being portrayed as either inspirational figures or people to pity. Most of the time storylines about disabled people are all about their impairment or how tragic their life is and how difficult everything is for them, and they all want to kill themselves because it's so terrible.
Or is that same thing, like a bit like Helen Keller, of either overcoming it marvelously or being horribly a victim to it, sort of thing?
Exactly, it's pity or pedestal, and there's no in between. There's no real life people, because at the end of the day, we're just people who happen to have impairments, and believe it or not, those impairments don't stop us from living rich, full lives and doing everything you can do. It's just we do things slightly differently if we need to. And it's funny because it takes me back to all my life. I've sort of been told that I'm brave, or you do so well, and I think, well, what? Breathing, yeah. It's all very well meant, that's the thing, it's all very well meant and heartfelt, and it's from a kind place. People think they're being inclusive or kind in recognizing or acknowledging that, but actually it's a symptom of the wider issue that you are othering me, and
you're clearly not in front of them as a whole person, are you, if someone's behaving that way to you?
Yes.
And I think it's very difficult when someone's doing you a massive disservice, but they're also doing it from a kind-hearted place. That is almost the most complicated thing to challenge. I mean, I haven't had to do it specifically, probably again in the ways that you have, but I've had to do it in other ways as for various, as a woman, and in various other parts of my life as a campaigner. And you can be outrightly angry with someone who's an open bigot, but it's very difficult when someone's got sort of bigotry they're not even aware of, and they really are trying to be nice, and you still have to kind of find a way to unpick it. And the onus again is on you to unpick it, and you do that work, because as a society we're shielding those attitudes. one of the best things piece of advice I was given by the wonderful Michelle Taylor when she was first mentoring me to be a better company, essentially. And one of the things that she said was, you don't need disabled roles. You just need to cast disabled people in any role they'd be like. Just look at them as actual actors, and would they suit a role? Like, don't have it as we wrote someone in who's got a wheelchair, so we've got disabled representation. It's like, just like audition actors of all different types and fit them to the role they're best suited for, and that's just great. That's just proper storytelling, isn't it? And
exactly.
Yeah,
incidental casting is the other thing that we really campaign for, and it almost feels like it has to be done step by step. So it almost feels like, right, can we represent ourselves and tell our own stories first, and then can you realize that once we're capable of doing that, we can actually just be cast in anything. But actually, I think, I'm still put up by my agent for all blind roles, but I have been just incidentally cast recently in other things as well. So I think it is happening, and it's happening sort of simultaneously, which is perfect, great. The other thing then is, if you're going to cater for having disabled people in your cast, obviously they have access requirements that you need to meet. So this is what puts a lot of people off, because it is a bit of additional work, but it is recognizing that it's everybody's responsibility to do that work. It shouldn't all fall on the disabled person to have to, navigate and explain and educate and put everything in place that they need. So, it is just something you have to do in a fair and equal society.
Also, you get a massive benefit from doing it. Like, your show is better because you've got a richer company. You're not,
yes.
You're not, if you don't, access requirements tend to benefit everybody anyway, actually. An easier working space is an easier working space for everybody. And also it's the same argument that I would say as a feminist, like, if you don't give women opportunity to contribute to society, you miss all of the riches and gifts and intelligence that women would bring to a society. Like, the whole society loses out. And I feel it's the same exactly as in the company. Every time that we do a mixed show or have a mixed company, we get a richer, more interesting story. So we're benefiting from the skills that are in that room. It is foolish and short-sighted of us to exclude those skills.
And isn't it interesting that we have lived in a predominantly white, middle class, male society driven society for such a long time that so many rehearsal rooms, for example, as indicative of wider society, but so many rehearsal rooms are just full of white middle class people. and then the Arts Council come along and say, well, no, you need a person of colour in there, or you need a disabled person in there, and it's seen as a chore a task to have to fulfil that. So it's interesting. What do you think about positive discrimination as playing a role in all of this?
I don't think of it as positive discrimination, actually, because I think that makes it sound like, because I think that blurs the concept of what discrimination is. So
right, yeah.
And I think it's a bit like what people say when you criticize male behavior and people say, oh, that's sexist. You're like, well, that really sort of undermines the 2,000 odd years of oppression that females have suffered at the hands of males, and that just lets men off the hook and muddies the waters. And let's not use the same terminology for two different. You could criticize me for generalizing, but sexism denotes quite a specific experience that women have at the hands of men, like that as a class, a sex class. Yeah. And I think it's similar with, so I would say, women-only shortlists are not a form of positive discrimination. They're very useful for how else do you in any way start to level a playing field, I suppose. So I think I think of it more in that way. I sort of, and it feels a bit like, again, if that's what it takes to get people to realize how beneficial an accessible room, rehearsal room, and a mixed company is, and how much they are going to get out of it. Because I definitely experienced that. I definitely never looked back once I'd started to work in that way. Started to work with Ramps on the Moon and be mentored by Michelle and things. I was like, I'd seen shows that I realized I was missing out on tons of fantastic actors because I didn't know how to work with them, and I was like, shame on me. And so if everyone else needs to be forced by not being given money if they don't have representative casts, I'm hoping they would then go, oh, we were really missing out. What fools we've been. We'll never go back. So I think if that's what it takes, I'm all right. I'm all right with it. And
I completely agree,
the Arts Council will give you give you chunks of money to do that access work. You know, you can have extra money to do it. There's really no excuse, except that we're frightened, and we're frightened of getting things wrong. So we have
that's
to.
Yeah, that's it. It's the fear, isn't it, and the ignorance, and the fear of ignorance, saying the wrong thing and doing the wrong thing. And if only people just realise that all they need to do is ask, you know, and just be open and have that natural conversation with people. We are a very hard group to offend. You know, we have to be, with the kind of crap we deal with every day.
Yeah.
You know, it's hilarious how we're sort of seen as the other or the different when you notice how non-disabled people can act around us. We've all got hilarious stories of the kind of behavior that we encounter every day, and it's just, and nobody wants to be that person. Nobody wants to, you know, so and that then drives them to behave strangely, and you just think, just relax, guys. Relax. And that's the key for everything, isn't it? But I completely agree with you. I think, you know, if whatever gets us in the door, once we're there, hopefully then people realise what a benefit it is to be diverse, to work diversely and inclusively, and really have different cultures and different communities and different stories and skills represented in that room. And invariably, the people I work with and introduce to access, and particularly in my case to integrated creative audio description, they all come away from it saying, that's really enhanced my work. You know, and the actors say that's really helped my process. And it's just, once you start implementing access for one group of people, you'll find it incidentally works for so many more people and makes things more interesting. It's about seeing it as an opportunity, isn't it? I think, as you said.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I think that we are, one of the things as a culture we have to get over, as you say, is our fear of our own ignorance and our fear of being criticised. Because again, just to relate it to my experience with being a feminist campaigner, you know, I regularly found if I called someone out on sexism, people were shocked and horrified, much more that I had called someone sexist than that they had been it. Like they had identified how awful it would be to be accused of being sexist, rather than the experience, identify the experience of having had someone be sexist to you. And I think it's that then we have to just kind of go, some of it is going to involve us going, oh, I wasn't doing that right, I need to change it. Like, yes, accept a small amount of criticism, because you will in the long term not be the person you fear, whereas if you hide yourself in that criticism, you will carry on being the person you don't want to be. So
that's it. Stop being defensive, and actually you can't learn if you're defensive or scared of criticism. You just can't learn, you can't develop,
and we can't evolve a society. We can't be an evolved society if we're rejecting that. If we're not being brave, I suppose, but it's not even that brave. It's just get on with it.
Yeah, well, exactly. That's it, isn't it? Yeah. Just get on with it. Just identify other people from other groups of society as similar to you. You know, we are more alike than we are different at the end of the day, aren't we?
Yes.
To completely bastardize that brilliant quote from, is it Maya Angelou?
It's Jo Cox. Oh God. Yes, it is Jo Cox, isn't it? Who is? Actually, I don't know where she got it from, to be fair. It was the lovely MP that got murdered. She famously talks about it. But I suspect if she got it from anyone, yes, let's say it was Maya Angelou, because
let's say that.
She comes up with the most wonderful things too, and I imagine would be an inspiration for anybody.
Yes.
Do you want to tell us something about the piece you're going to read, and then I will release you back into the wild?
Oh, thank you. You roam free with my herd. Yes, so I've done a reading. It's a speech. Well, actually, I thought it was a speech, but I come to realise I think it was actually a published piece that Helen Keller wrote called "Why Men Need Women's Suffrage," and it was written in 1913. And what particularly strikes me, I don't agree with everything she says, and again, it's got to be taken within the context of the time it was written, within which it was written. But I think it's what really struck me about it was so many of the points she makes are equally true today. things like, we lack intelligent direction and control in our governments, in our, in our society. It's like, oh God, Boris Johnson. Oh, so many of it rang true and resonated with me reading it. So, but really, I wanted to do a piece of her writing or speech because people need to know what an amazing speaker and writer she was. She had such a command of the English language, considering it was her second language as well. She was fluent in French, German, Russian, and she learned all of this by deafblind sign and physically lip reading others. And it is astonishing. It is a huge achievement what she learned to do. And as Caro and I were talking about, she wanted to learn to do it, and I think that is the key. If it's forced on one that they need to speak, then that's one thing, but she was hungry for that kind of communication and that kind of learning, so that was wonderful. But yeah, I just wanted to show have a representation of her in her adult years and the kind of fierce stuff she could come up with. And I urge anyone to read her speech Strike Against War as well, even if it's just the beginning, because she has this little jibe at editors who, I think, as James points out in his book, who basically said, oh, well, don't listen to her, because she was saying things they didn't agree with. Don't listen to her, she's disabled. She's only limited in what information she gets from people. So she can't, her opinions have no credence. So she comes back at them in the beginning of that speech with a brilliant few paragraphs that I just think are great.